Layoffs, low hotel occupancy rates, and a nation afraid to fly. Local economists are scratching their heads trying to come up with a way to get the desert boomtown back in business. What do the experts say it will take to get the Las Vegas economy back on track? We'll ask our guests next on Face to Face. Welcome to Face to Face. I'm Jon Ralston. Hotels report business is picking up on the Las Vegas Strip, but analysts fear the visitors who did make it here were lured by air travel and hotel offers they couldn't turn down. How long can the hotels afford to give away the house? Mike Sloan is an executive with Mandalay Resort Group, one of the major players in the gaming industry. Also joining us today, Guy Hobbs. He's formerly Clark County's budget man who now has his own consulting company, Hobbs, Ong & Associates. Gentlemen, thanks for being here today.
Thank you, John.
Well, let me talk to you first, Mr. Hobbs. You're the numbers expert. From what you've seen so far, you've crunched some of these numbers. Tell us what you found out, where you think this is going based on various scenarios.
Well, from a public sector perspective, we've been focusing on those revenue areas that we thought would have the biggest impact in the near term. And clearly one of those revenue sources is room tax revenue. And I'll remind you, too, that that's a revenue that the school district has a stake in for some of its building program. The county has a significant stake in it for building some of the resort corridor projects, and certainly the Convention Authority has a very large stake in it for both operating the convention facilities as well as the debt service on the expansion of the new facility and the existing facilities. And based on some preliminary numbers that we've run, and they're based on assumptions that we have yet to validate, we need some additional information from the hotels themselves as to actual occupancy rates and room rates that have been charged. Thus far, in the 2 weeks following, we project that somewhere between $4 and $5 million in room tax has been lost, and about the same amount in probable sales tax revenue loss.
Well, what about the issue, though, of the impact on governments? You worked in government, you worked for Clark County. What about the impact on governments providing services based on various scenarios? I mean, room tax, let's face it, is a relatively small component of what the problem is out there. Gaming and sales tax revenues obviously being the bigger ones. Have you looked at that at all?
Well, when you're talking about the bigger picture, clearly, John, gaming tax revenue at the state level is one of the three legs of the stool. I'm not sure that the third leg of the stool could be
I didn't know we had a third leg. Yeah.
But it's certainly one of the three legs of the stool and has to be watched very closely. Again, our concern about room tax is we had some near-term information about changing in pricing on some of the rooms, as you mentioned in your lead-in. Things that are being done to lure the people back. One of those includes adjustments in prices on room rates, and room tax revenue is directly computed based on the price of the room. So we expected to see some near-term implications there. And when you start talking about things like that, one of the first things that comes to my mind is credit quality and how the rating agencies view Nevada, Clark County, the Convention Authority, because it's a terribly important stake we have in their view of us when it comes to funding future infrastructure needs, which you know we have plenty to fund.
So speaking of future infrastructure needs, Mandalay Resort Group, like other companies, has postponed construction projects. You postponed a convention center project. Talk about the impact specifically on your company. I mean, how many people have you had to lay off? Is it hundreds? Is it thousands?
Well, there are several hundred employees, and I think the biggest difficulty is having any sense as to how the American public is going to respond to this circumstance. It's not the Las Vegas economy that's dictating what we're doing, it's the national economy. You have the fear of travel compounded by people who are frightened for their own job security and their own economic well-being. We don't have the luxury of a crystal ball that tells us what's going to happen tomorrow or the next day. We go by the cancellations that we've had for conventions, which have been substantial. And that's been industry-wide, not just our company. The call demand has picked up, but people are a little hesitant. I think they're making their decisions short-term. And as both you and Guy have indicated, a lot of people are responding to bargains, which are bringing us customers, but the revenues are nowhere near what they would have been otherwise. This is usually the best time of year. This 6-week period, the end of September and October, are the very best time in Las Vegas, and that's going to be very difficult to replicate. So I guess it's an everyday event, John. We don't know what's going to be tomorrow.
Well, obviously this is uncharted territory. The Gulf War analogy doesn't work. No analogy really works. Talk a little bit more about the customers. You mentioned some of them are coming from the bargain hotel rates. Are they also gambling a lot less than the average customer would have been at the same time of year?
Well, I think the amount of volume is down, certainly, in terms of gambling. It's compounded by the fact that the high-end business is sensitive to this kind of travel, but our expenses essentially have not gone down. They will as a result, unfortunately, of layoffs, but utility expenses would have been a huge increase in the gaming industry, 50% increase year over year. Our tax payments Our property tax payments go on regardless. Our gaming tax payments are going to reflect the drop in gaming volume, but they're based on our gross, not our net, so they don't take into account our expenses. I mean, if you look at the top line, you may see initially a 20 to 30% reduction for some companies, but at the bottom line, it'll probably be higher.
When we come back from this break, gentlemen, I want to talk to you a little bit about what some public officials have been saying the gaming industry should do, maybe saying don't lay off people, or maybe do it in some kind of staggered way. I want to ask you, Mr. Hobbs, a little bit about how much this blow might have been softened if the tax structure had been changed and we weren't so reliant on gaming and sales tax revenues. We're back to talk more about the future of Las Vegas and tourism when Face to Face returns.
You're watching Face to Face with Jon Ralston.
Thanks for sticking with us. We're talking to Mike Sloan of Mandalay Resort Group and Guy Hobbs, a financial consultant who used to work for Clark County, about the future of tourism here and the numbers and how bad it really is out there. You know, this is a very emotional time, too, because people get very upset when they get laid off. The public sees these big gaming companies, and you and I have talked many times through the years, they think that you have all this money, why do you have to lay off these people? And there's politicians who want to get involved in this. Mayor Goodman wrote a fairly well-publicized letter to the casinos, and he said in it, he said, I'm asking you to carefully consider the ramifications before you reduce your staff. To not do so may create a situation which could cause a socioeconomic disaster from which recovery would be difficult. Let me ask you a couple questions about that. First of all, what was the industry's reaction to the mayor kind of sticking his nose and telling you guys how to run your business? And secondly, I think some people think, God, they're laying off all these employees, yet they have all these millions that they can donate to the relief effort. People see that one of your rivals, MGM Mirage, is spending $15 to $30 million on internet gaming. I mean, explain those things.
Well, let me say this. I think that you'll find that nationwide layoffs have been occurring in a wide range of industries, whether it's Boeing or Ford. John Wilhelm, the head of the Hotel and Restaurant Workers Union nationally, says that somewhere between a third and a half of all of his employees nationwide are being laid off. Starwood's hotel chain has laid off 10,000 people. This is not a Las Vegas phenomenon. You face the very real prospect that you need to preserve the core business assets. I mean, the Aladdin Hotel would be a perfect example. If they can continue in business by laying some people off, it's probably preferable to closing their doors and laying everyone off. What we have been trying to do is to work out through voluntary arrangements with our employees that are not represented by unions, and with those unions that will work with us, an opportunity for people to all work a little bit less than they are currently working in order to preserve some and their benefits. But the reality is that this is, you know, something that government itself does in hard times. It lays people off.
You're saying basically that gaming companies are behaving no differently than any companies are around the country. Is the culinary union cooperating in? Are they willing to have reduced work hours and all kinds of other maybe creative solutions so they can keep their people working?
Well, I think that's a difficult issue that they are addressing. I mean, again, it's a question of the seniority rights of employees and people trying to decide whether or not they're going to make certain individual sacrifices for the greater good. The union has always, the culinary union has always been responsive to try to do the best they can to work with us, and that's a work in progress right now. They're exploring, but by and large we've gotten great cooperation from the employees, and we recognize there's hardships on that. We are trying, as are the unions, to make sure that health benefit protection is provided, that we do it in the best manner we can given the difficult economic circumstances. But the circumstances are very, very tough.
Well, let me get back real quickly to Mayor Goodman's letter. What did you think of that letter?
Well, I think that your characterization may be right, that there were probably people who felt that it was a little inappropriate for someone who knows almost nothing about our business to give us gratuitous advice, and then most of us read about it in the newspaper before we received this letter.
You know, the real cynical view is that your companies now have much more dedication to your shareholders and your stock price than you do to your employees, that you're these uncaring Goliaths, these corporate, you know, that you have all the cliches about, boy, when the mob ran you guys, it was much more sensitive to the employees, that kind of stuff. What can you do about anything, something like that?
Well, I don't know that that's a universal perception, although I gather any time somebody's economically impacted by a decision of their employer, they don't necessarily like it. Most of the companies have a pretty good working relationship with their employees. I think most of the employees have a fairly strong devotion to their employers. So that doesn't overcome the fact that we do have a fiduciary responsibility to the people who own the business, our shareholders. And many of our shareholders are our employees. So it's, it's kind of a vicious cycle. We're trying to do the best we can to preserve the core assets of the business, to take care of as many as employees as we can, and make sure that when this downturn is over, that we're ready to go forward. You don't want to destroy healthy companies by incurring substantial expenses that you can't meet. I
want to talk to you, both you gentlemen, when we come back, about this issue that both of you are very familiar with, about the tax base in this state and how the budgets might not have been as affected. Maybe if 10 years ago they had done what all the tax studies said they should have done, which is broaden the tax base. I want to talk about that issue when we come back. We'll be back to talk about the future of tourism and money in Las Vegas when Face to Face returns. Thanks for staying with us. We're talking about the impacts on the Las Vegas economy of what's going on in the national economy with Mike Sloan from Mandalay Resort Group and Guy Hobbs, a financial consultant. Let's talk, Mr. Hobbs. You've looked at finances of how government is funded for many, many years. 10, 12 years ago, there was the Price Waterhouse study that says you got to broaden the tax base. There's been plenty of studies. The gaming industry has paid for some. Wouldn't the impact be much less if you had broadened the tax base? The gaming revenues wouldn't have been as important proportionally. Neither would have sales tax revenues. I mean, this is making the case for this better than anything else could have.
Well, I'm not sure we needed this to happen to make the case. Perhaps to put the exclamation mark on it, yes. As you mentioned, going back to the Price Waterhouse study, they pointed out what we know about state government and what we know about local government. In both cases, each is heavily reliant on two sources of revenue, generally a 70% reliance on just two sources of revenue. In the state's case, the heaviest reliance is on gaming tax and sales tax. In local government's case, it's on property tax and sales tax. And that's led to a lot of discussion about the differences in the revenue mixes and which mix is better in the long run. But you're absolutely right. That was pointed out back then, as well as the problems with earmarking those revenues. What's happened since the Price Waterhouse study came out is very little has been done to diversify the revenue mixes. In fact, a greater reliance has been put on sales tax than existed back at the time we did the Price Waterhouse study. And more earmarking of funds has been done. So it does put an exclamation mark on it. I want to say, too, that it's clear that at the state level with the reliance on gaming tax that perhaps had the mix been different, the outcome of this could be different. The same thing does exist at the local level, and I definitely want to emphasize that. With the reliance on consolidated tax, which is primarily sales tax, there's a huge segment of that, approximately 28–29%, which is driven heavily by tourism. And so local governments have the same
and
level
that affects
of exposure.
The school district too.
Unquestionably, you have 2.25% of the 7.25% right now that is an offset to the state's funding requirement for schools. And so the state is not uninvolved with the local school impacts either.
And the way that the law reads, is the way I understand it, is if the school district can't meet their obligations, the state has to, by law, make up the difference, which is then another impact on the state.
That's absolutely correct. You set a per pupil funding amount, and you have local revenues like the 2.25% sales tax and a piece of property tax that offset that per pupil funding amount. And to the extent that those offsets aren't there, the state has to backstop that.
How long can you go on, do you think, just any projections that you've made before certain things do kick in, the state having to help out the school district, maybe having to tap the rainy day fund at the state, which we showed in the still has about $136 million. How long can we go?
That's one of the things that we're working on right now, and obviously it's highly based on assumptions about the degree to which the problem will continue to manifest itself here. What will occupancy do is important. What will the average daily room rate do? What will the spending patterns of the folks that come here do that have been known to spend $1,400 per stay, half of which basically goes to gaming and half of which basically goes to non-gaming revenues? Is there going to be a large shift in that?
Well, real quickly here, though, what do you really think? I mean, best and worst case scenarios, are we talking it could be weeks, it's probably going to be months? What do you think?
If it's isolated to the events that took place 2 weeks ago, the recovery at the government level, I would imagine, would be over a course of several weeks to a few months to get things back in order without having to hit the contingency funds and the rainy day funds, which would be a negative signal to the rating agencies, which we do not want to do. I mean, we very much want to show these folks that we're on top of this issue and in control of the response to the issue.
You know, you've been one of the more vocal people in the gaming industry over the years about this broad-based business tax and broadening the tax base. The truth is, too, that people don't realize is that 10 years ago, the mix of revenues was different, too, inside gaming companies, in the sense that there's a lot more sales tax coming from inside gaming companies now with all the retail and dining emphasis. This has become even a worse problem now, hasn't it?
Well, I think so. I mean, clearly, we are big payers as well as collectors of sales tax, and then with the explosion of the growth in the past 5 or 6 years, we built those properties, paid a huge sales tax on that. So I think it's compounding the problem. And as you say, a number of people have been saying for more than a decade we need to address this. We haven't. It's ironic, in Florida they're calling a special session to consider the economic impact on their tourism industry. And they're saying, well, we don't have a personal income tax. We have a corporate income tax, but we're going to have a shortfall. Maybe we have to look at doing something personally. The irony is, in Florida and Hawaii, they're looking at granting tax relief to their tourist industry, which are a smaller part of their overall budget. And here, people are saying, well, let's see, maybe gaming should somehow even shoulder more of the burden than they already are, as opposed to saying, how about the other businesses in the state of Nevada?
Yeah, the real problem is that while people here like the gaming industry, you like the polling, they also think you guys should be the first ones to be taxed. They don't think you guys should get any kind of favorable treatment. Yep. And it's like the national debate that's going on with the talk of maybe a corporate income tax break at this time. If you tried to suggest that here, people would go crazy, wouldn't they?
Well, I think so. I mean, there's proposals out of the travel industry already asking for 100% tax deductibility for business travel. In Hawaii, the governor suspended landing fees for airplanes so that they could try and encourage more air travel. But I say, in other tourist-dependent economies, although not as dependent as our own, they are rushing to try and figure out what they can do to help their tourist industry. And as you say, perhaps there's a historical bias here that people say, well, let gaming fend for themselves, and that may not work this time.
Well, when we come back for our last segment, Jim, I want to talk a little bit more about the future, get your views on what should be being done by the political system and what they shouldn't do to make things worse when we come back. We'll be back to talk about tourism and the future of Las Vegas when Face to Face returns.
You're watching Face to Face with Jon Ralston.
Thanks for sticking with us. We're talking about the economic effects of what happened on September 11th here in Las Vegas. Let me ask you, Mr. Hobbs, you've mentioned a couple of times this whole issue of the credit rating for governments, which is something that most people don't even really understand can affect then government's ability to do certain things. What are the things that you're really worried about could happen, that the governments could do, that signals that could be sent from here that could be a problem for that?
Well, clearly, the rating agencies, interestingly, the day after the attack, put all of the airlines on credit watch. Most of the airports in the country within a week were put on credit watch. All of those other industries, particularly the tourism industries, are being looked at right now by the rating agencies. The rating agencies effectively assign a credit quality to us that then dictates the rate of interest that we pay when we borrow money. As a growing community and one that still has pent-up infrastructure demand, the cost of borrowing the money is extremely important to us. We have a AA credit rating here, which is extremely strong. We want to maintain that, and so our task in the days ahead will be to talk to the rating agencies and reassure them that all of the safeguards that were there as a part of getting the AA credit rating are still in place and will get us through these challenging
So essentially
times.
the effect, though, if you get downgraded, is it's going to slow down the ability to get some of these projects done because it's harder to raise the money to do it, is what
It makes it far more expensive and has the opposite effect of what you'd like it to have right now. It increases the burden on existing taxes.
The real problem now, I think you'd be worried about as a gaming executive, is some kind of overreaction by the political system. They call a special session, they decide to raise the gaming tax, something nightmarish like that. On the other hand, while some people, D. Taylor from the Culinary Union mentioned this when he was on the show, this should be catalyzing the discussion that we were talking about broadening the tax structure. But that's real unlikely to happen in this kind of crisis atmosphere, isn't it?
I agree. I don't think that's something they're going to address in the immediate aftermath of this crisis. But I think it does have people focusing on that being a long-term need. It's not just something that might be good to do, it's essential to do. I also agree with you that the government has to carefully deliberate before it takes decisions, makes decisions about what they should need to do. The priority right now should be in terms of making sure that essential programs are there for people who are laid off, to assist people in terms of the unemployment compensation, to see that it's extended, that health benefits are provided, and those kinds of humanitarian issues are addressed. And then if there are things that can be targeted to help us in terms of revising the tourist economy, things that make sense that are being done in other states, then clearly we ought to consider them.
What about at the federal level? I mean, you know, they talked about the bailout of the airlines. I mean, the tourism industry is such a huge industry in this country. Why shouldn't the federal government be doing something? And are you asking them at all as an industry to do anything?
There are moves afoot in Washington now from the broad-based coalition of people in tourism asking for increased deductibility of travel expenses related to business trips. The Culinary Union and other unions are asking for health protection for their workers. That would be important to us given the huge number of employees in this town.
What does that mean? Does that mean somehow the federal government would step in to provide health benefits?
Well, here we have a situation with the Culinary Union where people who are no longer employed have 4 months of benefits that are already paid for. That's paid in advance, and since they don't have any premium share, they'll be assured for a 4-month period of having health care. Going forward, then they have a copay requirement. One of the things that the Culinary Union has suggested that Congress look at is extending COBRA rights to people who have been laid off, so they could make a monthly payment themselves that doesn't require them to actually be employed. That might be useful. But there are those kinds of things that help people who most urgently need them, and I do think broad-based, the tourism impact is probably as significant as the airlines. So there will be efforts in Washington. The NRA will be part of that, as will be the AGA, of trying to make sure that our industries are represented in that.
What's the most important thing that both the gaming industry and kind of the political elite here can do to send kind of an optimistic message? That's how you get people back here, is to send some kind of, there's a value here or something like that. What's the most important thing, do you think?
Well, I think right now we are focusing on value, but a large part of it is beyond our real ability to do. I mean, assuring people of safety of the airlines is not something that local government in Nevada or necessarily hotel executives can do. And people have a continuing concern about their own economic well-being. So if they're worried about layoffs in Detroit or Chicago or New York, again, I'm not certain other than appealing to their sense of value.
Things are really out of our control, is basically what you're saying. All right, gentlemen, we're out of time. Thanks for the discussion. Appreciate your being here. Let's take a look at some of our face-to-face feedback. This week we talked with city and county emergency managers about their preparedness for terrorist attacks. Rick, who says he's been involved in training regarding terrorist use of nuclear and biological warfare for the past 20 years, wrote to us and said, I have very strong feelings regarding the use of nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare within the civilian community and the lack of a coordinated response by our emergency agencies. Actually, what we found out on that show is that there's more coordination going on now in the wake of those attacks than ever before. About the fundraising for victims of terrorist attacks, Jane wrote and said, how much of the monies raised for the relief funds for New York City will actually get to the victims' families? Will administrative fees be waived? We called the Red Cross and they told us that 6% of the money raised for their disaster relief fund goes to administrative costs. As for other funds, don't be afraid to call and ask their main headquarters directly. If you'd like to comment on any of our programs, email your feedback to ralston@vegas.com or call me at 870-7997. We'll read your responses on the air. On the next Face-to-Face, President Bush promises the first war of the new millennium will be unlike anything we've seen. The nation's defenses are aimed at terrorism worldwide. This foe has no face and no nation. Is America venturing into the unknown, or are we prepared for conflicts once reserved for the silver screen? Future War on the next Face-to-Face, only on Las Vegas 1.